this, we're taking 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 with a pinch of salt.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear ERA community, welcome to another episode of A Pinch of Salt, a new podcast series by the ERA. My name is Andres Kubernet, and I'm your host for this podcast. I'm particularly glad that we have as our guest today Dr. Samira Farouk. Now, Samira is one of the few nephrologists that I'm aware of, at least, that has her own Wikipedia page. So let me quote a little bit from it to introduce her quickly. Samira is a nephrologist and associate professor of medicine and medical education at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She has a long track record in nephrology-related social media. She's on the executive board of the Nephrology Social Media Collective and a co-founder of NephSim, a virtual nephrology teaching tool that won the 2018 ASN Innovations in Kidney Education Contest. That's a cool site. I would advise you to check it out. NephSim, NephSim. She was part of the nephrology podcast Freely Filtered, hosted through the Nephrology Journal Club, the well-known NephJC. And I could go on because there's much more, but that's not the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is that there are a number of us who have not grown up in the age of the internet, the age of smartphones and social media, and we have been on occasion described as dinosaurs. Now, I don't particularly mind being called a dinosaur. I kind of liked them when I was a kid, but I do mind if things are taking place that might really help me in my quest to gain relevant and up-to-date knowledge quickly, but I don't know where it is, how to reach it, and how to use it. It really seems to me that things are changing, that there's a revolution taking place in terms of how we learn about and talk about nephrology. So if there are any dinosaurs out there, she's here to help. Welcome, Samira, to A Pinch of Salt.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and really excited to talk with you a little bit about the nephrology space and how social media has really become a part of that.
Yeah, so for those of us who are not aware of the social media or using it currently, this is a big black hole, I think. And for those of us, how would you explain what is going on in the social media world regarding nephrology? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think to start, what are social media? I think we may have some perceptions of that, but actually Wikipedia has a pretty good definition of what they are. And so they're interactive computer-based technologies that allow for two main groups that I think about. So one is the creation and sharing of information, and the second is the building of these virtual communities and networks. And so how nephrology fits into those two things, for the first piece, the creation and sharing of information, very relevant to really all spheres when we think about medicine. So not only education and research, but also in some ways a direct impact on the clinical care. So by creation and sharing, we mean sharing of journal articles that are coming out, yesterday. You can share them on social media today, reaching a wide audience. That is one of the important mechanisms that I use to stay up to date with the nephrology research. The creation piece of that is really where I've spent the most time over the last 5 to 6 years in this arena known as free open access medical education. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But briefly, that just means that somebody has created an online tool that is freely accessible via the internet. So anybody that has the access to the internet can access that. And then that is a tool that is designed to teach. And in this case, we're talking about nephrology. And so free open access medical education, we sometimes abbreviate it as FOAM or FOAMed, can really refer to a wide variety of different styles and types of media. So that could be a website, that could be a podcast, that could be an individual blog post, could be a webcast, it could be a video series, and in some cases can even be an interactive game, interactive conference that is being virtually live streamed. And the key component of it is that it is going to be freely accessible. And so there are no paywalls, there are no fees. It is just there for the purpose of learning. And the second piece that I think has been important not only for nephrology, but other communities within different medicine specialties is the virtual creation of communities and networks, and going beyond what you might be able to interact with within your individual practice or institution. So going beyond that, not only within the US, but also being able to collaborate and hear viewpoints from individuals that are outside of your country and around the rest of the world. And so, for example, that we are able to have this connection. Part of that would be, I would say, related to use of social media. So to give, one example of the communities, not only, can you find people with similar interests on different social media platforms, such as, not only nephrologists, but, I really like to follow tennis, so I can follow up, accounts that are also sharing information that I'm interested in. But you can use these as spaces to have a dialogue, to have even organized chats. And so one example of that is the nephrology chat called NephJC, which meets virtually on a social media platform, Twitter or X, where a journal article is selected, generally one that has been published fairly recently, thought to be high impact. And so there's a 1 hour virtual, very, I would say, high level conversation about that article where everybody really comes to the table having already read the article and being familiar with some of the background information. And so, to compare that to, an in-person journal club, I think in some ways the virtual one is a lot more interactive and can also be more fruitful because there's some more preparation involved. And I think a key feature of that, which as a trainee was really, really interesting for me, was we can actually invite the authors of these articles to come themselves and participate in the conversation. So I think that's a really powerful opportunity to be able to ask an author of a study, why did you do this analysis, or why did you choose X database, or can you elaborate a bit more on this piece of the paper?
Yeah, so what I find interesting about NephJC, because I went to check it out, was that you not only get the recap of the paper, you also get some, I would say, insight into how what is good about it, possibly what not. Of course, this is subjective opinion, but it is opinion from people who have done this a lot, which some of us might not be. So that's definitely interesting, because the thing I ask myself, okay, so why do I want to use this, right? So one way is to catch the latest papers. Now, there are those of us who like to read things, the readers, but there are those of us then who like to listen. I think people are generally divided into people who are better readers and people who are better listeners. And for readers, you have the papers, you've always had them. But for listeners, you had nothing until this point, I would say. So probably this is a good thing for listeners, right? For somebody who likes to listen and gain information in that way.
Yeah, I think, that I think really ties well into sharing how I got interested in this space. And so my interest in this is really from the education side. And so I've been interested in education ever since I was a trainee, and really particularly relevant within the nephrology space, which, as you may know, in the United States, we have a challenge with recruiting in the last, I would say, a decade or so, applicants that are interested in applying for nephrology fellowships and then ultimately completing them. And so just to give you a sense of the numbers on that, when we have our annual, what we call the nephrology fellowship match, where interested applicants are going to be assigned to their nephrology training positions, at the end of that match, about 50% of those spots in the US have been left unfilled. So there has been a lot of attention about why is that the case, and a theme that continues to come up. And obviously selection of a subspecialty is a complicated decision, and factors like compensation are definitely a part of that conversation. But one theme that continued to emerge is that trainees that have been surveyed or asked questions have shared that nephrology is too hard, it's too complex, they didn't have mentors to guide them in that direction, and that the patient population that we take care of is just what they perceive to be too sick. And so that led to some examination of how we teach nephrology in our current system. And so my personal thoughts on that are, looking at how very junior trainees, so for example, medical students, are exposed to nephrology. It is incredibly complicated. And they're shown a very complex diagram of the nephron. Sometimes the clinical context is not really there. They're really focused on the math, how do you calculate, manually the creatinine clearance. And so I think, when they're being exposed to many different other fields, it can be easy to think that, let me pick something else. So my goal with free open access medical education tools that I have been a part of has been to try to teach nephrology in a way that is more engaging, still teaches the content, but in a way that is more approachable. So a little bit more bite-sized in a way that can be more easily digested. And social media really provides the perfect, kind of platform for that. And so, for example, NephSim is a nephrology teaching resource designed for nephrologists to use as a teaching tool and for non-nephrologists to use as a learning tool. And everything that is on NephSim, whether it's cases or infographics or tutorials, is designed to kind of break things down in a way that is a little bit more simple than what you might find in perhaps, a traditional textbook. So that being said, I think social media tools, as you mentioned, some people prefer reading, some people prefer listening. These tools are not for everybody. We know that learners have different learning styles. And so, we talk about learning, talk about it broadly, how do you consume research? And so I think for many individuals, including myself, social media is very supplementary. And so it's not a replacement. And so some of the criticism that PhoMed tools have faced have somewhat been, they're not comprehensive enough. They cannot replace textbooks and other, lectures or lecture slides. But the goal is not really to do that. The goal is for somebody to get a nephrology lecture and then use these resources as a way based on what their learning style is. So if that's listening, then there are podcasts available that may be very helpful. If that's visual, then infographics and those types of more visual tools can be very, very helpful. So yeah, I think, and coming back to the NephJC example, which you mentioned, the NephJC chat is probably not going to be very helpful if you have not read the paper yourself and spent a little bit of time really thinking about that. But what that NephJC chat does do is provide you the opportunity to come and ask your questions in a space where you can have some sort of meaningful discussion. And then with NephJC comes other PhoMed materials. So there is a what we call the visual abstract, which is, a one slide graphical representation of the paper. So say you haven't read the paper, you can review that and at least see how the study was designed, what was the main outcome, what was the main conclusion, and then have some sort of meaningful conversation. But, I think for people to say that, the NephJC conversation replaces your own, time spent reading the paper, I think that would be insufficient.
Yeah, there's always some idea that these things compete with each other, but they don't really, right? So whatever works for you, I guess. And everybody could read the paper at the end of the day. So you mentioned something that I found really interesting because many countries in Europe are struggling with attracting young students, or I should say people who've finished medical school to nephrology. And that point you made, I think, is really interesting. That we should probably present it in a way that is something that somebody from this century is used to consume or intake. So NephSim, for example, is then not just a platform to be used by students, but also by educators, right? So you can use that to get closer to the younger generation, let's say, if I understand it correctly, for example.
Yeah, I think, just like learners, educators also have their own teaching styles. And so depending on what your style is, you may find something that is on NephSim that you may use to, again, supplement your own teaching that you may be doing. And so one common example of how NephSim may be used in a trainee setting is so that, if you are on, say, inpatient rounds, for example, and you just finished rounding on a patient that had hyponatremia, and you've had a conversation, about your approach and what you think is a diagnosis, what are the next steps, there is supplementary material on nephsin that you may then share with the trainee to really try to help maybe solidify or cement that. And so we have a couple infographics on nephsin related to hyponatremia. And so, if I work with a trainee about a hyponatremia case, after we finish, our, in-person discussion, I'll usually, maybe text them or email them those infographics. And I know from, experience and talking with some of these trainees that many of them will then save that to their phone. And then when they're then teaching someone, whether it's a medical student or in the future, then now that becomes a little bit of a cycle to continue to pass it along. And I think one of the benefits, which I think can be seen as a critique of free open access medical education, is that people have always said, well, who is reviewing this material? You are who you are, and you're just making something, and we're supposed to believe it as accurate. So I think, peer review is a really important part of the free open access medical education tool process. And there are actually some formal metrics that can be used to assess the quality of FOMED. And one of the important pieces of that is being transparent about what is your peer review, allowing a platform for open commentary to allow the creators to see that feedback, and then if you are the FOMED creator, to then make those changes. So for example, when I first started to talk about nephsim several years ago, and that these are the cases that we had, and so the first question I would get was, well, this is not a peer-reviewed journal, so who is looking at this? How do we know that this is correct? So we do some basic things. So for example, in our explanations, we try to keep the text referenced. We have faculty peer reviewers, and I will tell you that when we share a new case via social media, it is the fastest peer review I've ever seen. Within 30 seconds, all the typos will be found, and we will be notified about them, and then you correct them. And sometimes, people find errors that definitely are errors, but other times there are errors that are a bit controversial that we maybe didn't know were controversial. And so we can go back and then reflect that, and perhaps sometimes incorporate, what other individuals of the community have shared. And so that has been a really kind of exciting piece of this as well. And so I think social media, again, provides the opportunity for that dialogue to happen. So it's not just a one-way space. So to giving, an example from the other side, if you're reading a textbook and there's an error in it, unless you have the errata list and it has been identified before, there's really nothing you can really do to, talk to anybody about, hey, I think there's a mistake here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, with social media, I get a lot of feedback. I can imagine that. And sometimes some of it is not constructive, I guess, but the constructive one is really useful. And to be more philosophical about it, perhaps, I think we tend to teach our students to take any kind of material with a pinch of salt, right? Even in published papers with peer reviews, some things you might wonder about or should think about, so but of course, as a provider of some materials, as a provider of materials on social media, you should be, of course, interested on the quality of the data. But let's not get too much into the specifics. Let's come back to the basics. So for example, what would your advice be for people who have zero experience using social media on how to join this easily and start the journey of discovery in this weird world of social media?
Yeah, before I answer that, I think it's important to mention that the social media landscape, particularly for nephrology, I think is in a little bit of flux, given the recent changes to, the Twitter that has been renamed X platform. And so those of us that have been using it for many years have seen some, changes that have maybe made it not as effective as it once was. And so, without getting into specifics, it's not as easy to find some of the content that you may want. And of course, we know some of the regulations and things like that have changed. So with that being said, I think, in the next several years, this will settle down. So how do you get involved? I think an analogy that someone once shared with me when I was first, dabbling in social media was to view it as a little bit like a cocktail party. And so, you walk into the party, there are different groups of people that are having conversations. You may or may not know anyone. And you initially just start by just looking around and listening and see what people are talking about. And so what does that mean in the context of social media? So that first means picking a platform. And so again, for the last several years, a leading platform in the nephrology space was X. And I think now many people are still using that, but there have been some other platforms that have grown a bit. I'm not using those as frequently, but there are nephrologists that are using platforms such as Mastodon or another platform called Blue Sky. But the concepts are the same. So, joining whatever the platform may be, and Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all also count as social media, just not platforms that I use as regularly. And so joining that, and then following a few accounts, and I think not too many accounts to start is really important, to not have what the content you're seeing be too overwhelming. And so if you know who people are in nephrology that you have heard about or have seen, that might be a good person to follow. Other accounts that I think when I was first starting I liked following were journals. Most journals now have a social media account. Nephrology societies, so like the National Kidney Foundation, the American Society of Nephrology, and then kind of just seeing the content that they're putting out. And then the next phase from that, and there's a nice diagram of the phases of a Twitter user that go all the way from denial or not knowing anything to obsession.
Denial.
Um,
Yeah.
and then trying to engage with the content as one feels comfortable. And I think for everybody, like anything else, there really is a spectrum on how involved you want to be. So you may be someone that logs onto the social media platform once a week and spends about 10 minutes and sees what's there, or you may be someone that is logging in more regularly and an active contributor in the conversations, developer of FOMED, disseminating that education via social media tools. And I think, once you see how that feels, I think the rest kind of figures itself out. And if you are interested in doing a little bit more, I think the Nephrology Social Media Collective 1-year virtual internship for me was very helpful in learning how I could learn some of these social media skills that I had not learned elsewhere. So, how to make a visual abstract, how to host an online chat, how to build a website, and then how can you leverage social media to enhance what your career goals already are. So whether you're a clinician, whether you're primarily a physician scientist, whether you're a clinician educator, or some combination of those things, I think there is always some way for social media to enhance that a little bit more. So for example, if you're a basic science researcher, social media platforms may be a nice space for you to be able to disseminate your work to a different audience, and maybe what you're getting through the automated emails that are going out from the journal. And there are ways to quantify this. And if we think a step ahead to academic promotion, for example, usually the goal of promotion at an academic institution is to show your impact in the field and whatever it is that you're working on. And so social media allow for you to capture some of those metrics. So for example, if you have a research article, you can actually see, in using various tools, what was my social media impact on this? So how many social media captures were there? How many people viewed this? How many people engaged with this? And that sits alongside of the more traditional metrics of, how many times did people click on my article via a different search engine that might be, outside of social media. And so that, I think, is a great way to show impact. And for people that are doing, something a little less traditional, like FOMED, for example, a lot of concrete ways to capture that viewership. So for example, NEFSIM is hosted on by WordPress, which is a fairly simple to use platform to build a website. And with that comes access to a lot of analytics of who is coming to the website. So, we've had NEFSIM, we launched it in June of 2018. So it's actually will be its 6th birthday tomorrow. And we've just surpassed a little over 1 million views. And so that means page views, so the number of times someone clicked on that. And so that is also a way for you to see how many people you're reaching, which is something that we think about in the context of social media. So I think how to get involved is to really just see what's out there, see what is of interest to you, see how this platform can help you. And for some people, it doesn't help. Some people don't like it, and that is also fine. Not everything is for everyone. And another question that I get often is, well, there's everything in the news about too much screen time and how social media and, use of apps is, linked to poor mental health. And the response to that is, even if you're not using social media for nephrology, you're probably using it for something else. And so for me, I prefer to use that time to look at nephrology things. I really don't use social media apps in these other contexts. And I was also share that when I was a resident taking overnight call in our medical ICU, I was so depressed looking at, what vacations my friends and everyone were taking that I actually deleted my Facebook account, and I still to this day have not reactivated it. And so social media, I think, use is different for everybody. Some people really like that connection, that they can keep in touch with people that they don't see or speak with as often. So I think it's really individualized, and not every level of engagement is going to be the same for everyone. But with the newer generation of learners, they will be engaging on these platforms. And so having a little bit of knowledge, at least, of how they operate and what benefit they can bring, I think can be helpful in enhancing, teaching nephrology and also moving the field forward in a kind of broader sense.
Yeah. I think the destructive part of social media is the part that kind of drains your soul. I think we all understand what that is. And if you bypass that part, it could be actually something that fills your soul. So I guess the basic message is then that it's everybody can do it. It's not that difficult. Just try it out and find out what works for you, right?
Yeah, and another message that some people that have been using social media a lot, and I would, this medical academic space would say is, thinking about what is your social media brand. So, what are the topics that you are most interested in, and trying to narrow your use of social media to that area. So for me, for example, I'm a transplant nephrologist, so very interested in anything related to the care of patients with kidney transplants, very interested in any of these free open access medical education tools. So, for example, if there's an article on that and I see that, I might want to reshare that. NephSim is a huge part of my brand. I really, use my own personal account, as well as I have a social media account for NephSim. Those two kind of work together to try to amplify the material that is there, and trying to really kind of stay within that. And then, I would say I have a couple side brands, like, as I mentioned, the tennis is a little bit of a side brand. I'm a big sports fan I grew up right outside Philadelphia. So all of the Philadelphia sports teams are very special to me. And so I use that as my platform to show my support for those teams. So I think, there can be, for some people, a little bit of a mix of the personal as well, as long as it doesn't, get into that, destructive category.
Okay. Well, interesting. Well, sorry about the 76ers. You had a lot of injuries this year. I'm hoping next year is going to be better.
Oh, it's classic to be a Philly sports fan. We had the 76ers, the Eagles that, totally had a meltdown towards the end of the season. So yes, we're used to it.
Okay. So if you had only one message to give young up and coming nephrologist, or maybe the vice versa to a senior nephrologist who's not part of this world, you can choose whatever you want to do. What would it be? What would that advice be? One piece of advice.
I think the message to both would be to think about how a social media platform might be able to enhance their careers, their learning, their teaching, and to really understand that there are a variety of these social media platforms, and they exist for the purpose of allowing for creation, sharing, and building of community and network. And I think those three things are really at the heart of how we can advance this goal of providing better kidney care, which is, I think, what we're all trying to do, regardless of, what angle we're coming at it from. And then I think maybe a second piece of that might be, if you have some apprehension, that is normal and that is okay. But before you, write it off, maybe see a little bit about what is going on in those spaces. And there are ways to, learn about, for example, a, FOAMed tool via social media. That doesn't mean you have to be tweeting about something, but maybe you learn about that, and now maybe you can share that with the next trainee that you work with. So there are many people on these social media apps, and they're called lurkers, and those are people that have accounts that are, reading everything and taking everything in, but they never engage with the content. They never actually say anything, and that is probably a large percentage of people, and that also is great because you are still able to learn something from that. So as an example, there are probably lots of people that follow Nexim as a social media account and see the content that are there, but are not necessarily, pointing out the typos for us, even if they see them. But they know that now there is a new infographic on polyuria that maybe they can keep in the back of their mind the next time that might come up in the clinical setting. So I think that
So
would be advice.
It's okay to be a lurker.
Definitely okay to be a lurker. And some days that's all you can do is be a lurker. And I think some
Yeah.
people are very effective lurkers. I know some people that I work with that I didn't even know had social media accounts, just it's never come up in conversation. And then they'll tell me about something that, is very, very recent information. I said, how do you know that? I said, oh, well, I saw it on Twitter, and it's always kind of mind blowing. And so you don't really know who's there. And I think that is the other, we didn't really talk about this, but an area to be mindful of is that social media is kind of a hot mic. It is always on. And if you share something there, it is fully public on many platforms. And so, a general rule of thumb that we sometimes share is that, if you're sharing anything patient related, so say, for example, you're trying to get some advice, do not share enough information that the patient would be able to recognize themselves. So making sure you're changing those identifying details. And then whenever I share something on social media, a few things that I think about are, how would my family and friends feel if they saw this? How would my colleagues feel if they saw this? And then maybe most importantly, how would my boss feel if they saw this? Because once it's out there, it is out there. And sometimes I think when people get in the heat of the moment in some of these conversations, you feel like you're having a private conversation, but you're really having a conversation for the entire world to see.
Yeah, that's a good thing to have in the back of your mind. So we've come to the last question, which is like a getting to know you kind of questions, even though I think we got to know you a bit already. But this question is, which book, 2 songs, and luxury item would you take to a desert island?
Yes, very, very hard question. So I'll start with the 2 songs. So I'm a huge fan of Celine Dion. So I can't pick which 2 songs, but I would pick 2 of her songs. They bring me a lot of joy, and I'm really happy that she's starting to feel a little bit better, and looking forward to seeing her new documentary.
Okay.
Um, Luxury item would be
A social media account. No,
yes,
I don't know. Maybe something else.
um, being comfortable, I think is really important. So I think maybe bring, luxury, bedding items, luxury sweatshirts, socks, sweatpants, those kinds of things.
Okay.
And what is the book that I would bring? I think there's so many great books out there. I recently read a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. That is it's a short book, but it really reviews some of the mental tenacity that is needed to be a good tennis player, and kind of relates that to how you might apply that to real life. So I think I would bring that book as a reminder of how to stay grounded and focused.
That's really interesting. I think sports can teach us a lot of things about psychology, even those of us who are not athletes, obviously. So, okay, Samira, thank you very much. It was very interesting, very enlightening for those of us for whom this is new. I think this will be a lot of help, and I'm real grateful that you've taken your time to do this. And well, thanks again, and maybe we might catch you in the social media space.
Thanks so much for having me.